Testmikrofon. Oh, das klingt fantastisch.
Ja, ja, die warten alle und dann hat das vieles passiert was. Yes. Yeah. No, I did. Oh, you didn't. Okay. So we just just a second. Dominic, say something, please.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Can you hear that?
Once again, please.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
What about if I talk like this though, and not if I don't move my head, I just do this? Can you hear me now?
It's like a kidney, like it follows you. It's like a cloud in the front of your face. So it's called kidney, like kidney.
Yeah.
So kidney cells, and then there's this.
Doesn't make me feel better now. Though. I've got something floating in front of my face.
It's a huge heart.
All nice and warm.
It's a cuddly lecture.
Okay, we wait for the academic quarter, like last time. It's really interesting.
No, I think I'm just going to do it with the cursor here because you can see.
Fine. Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
It's probably better for on the screen as well. You know, on remote.
Yeah, by the way, it was a great good talk this afternoon.
Yep. Yeah, there's a couple of other things as well I want to talk to you about. Another master plan in the UK. I need to get some more details I can throw them to you, but there's a master plan in Wales too. 200 bedroom. Today it's actually Wales Swine, so I couldn't do it.
Really? But that's funny. Interesting.
You can't say it.
It's just
It's kind of what it is.
yeah, it just has to be. But you know what?
Yeah.
I think we got it Steht alles. Shall we start? Sunday comes late, I would say. You hear me from here as well? Yes?
Turn it a little bit in your direction, please.
No, I'm just walking a bit closer. Okay, hello everybody in the hall, but also online. It's a pleasure to see you here, and I have Dominic Papa here for the second round of the November Talks. We had the first one last week. November Talks are part of November Festival, let's say, and it's the first year in Vienna. I think there were several talks already in London, Venice, Copenhagen, Stuttgart. And we are proud to be part of the Sto Foundation now having this here in Vienna. Unfortunately, be in this new normality, but it's quite what I heard today, that it's quite nice even online, looking into a space and seeing people talking and discussing in the space, which I think is also for all of us pretty important. I really like to introduce Dominic Papa from Studio Woodruff Papa. I got as a friend and also colleague. We used to work together, and Dominic studied in Portsmouth, I think together with your partner Jonathan, and then went to different offices in the UK, and worked also in the Netherlands. And I think the work and also experience in the Netherlands informed pretty much, let's say, how they work. Also between the disciplines architecture and urbanism, urban design. Very interdisciplinary work. We work also together on different projects. I think one he will also show tonight. Like all the others, kind of architects and teams, kind of we invited this year. We were looking really to architecture firms that work cross-discipline and also kind of contribute to the public space or the urban space. I like the title, kind of how can architecture inform or choreograph urban space. And I think Dominic will talk us through different kind of scales of projects. I really was always inspired by their work, and it's also always very, very nice to collaborate because there's a kind of a common language. And I think that interdisciplinarity, but also kind of working through architecture, urbanism, till landscape, I think he will also touch that topic tonight. We will hear something now, and I'm a pleasure to give the word to Dominic, and then we can discuss also with the crowd in the hall kind of later some topics. So thank you very much, and looking forward to listen to what you present tonight. And I was also very curious about the title, Associationism, Cooperation and Civic Life, which I think kind of will, and new active grounds, talking about it in between space. I think we will hear a lot tonight.
Thank you very much, Rita. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a fantastic new experience to talk to people in a room. Even if there's only, a few, it's a lot better than none. So thank you very much for that. So I was quite excited getting on the plane this morning to fly somewhere new, different, and to talk to people. So hopefully you'll enjoy it too. Associationism, I can't even say it either, you see. So there you go. That's why I write it down. It's a difficult word even for an English person to speak English sometimes with the kind of words that we have. But I wanted to take an approach this evening and for the talk really that was looking at something quite particular in what we're seeing as something that is really transforming our cities, or it needs to transform our cities, and the way that we move around our cities and the way we need to think about urbanism and architecture moving forward. And it's what we call drivers of change. These are global trends that are affecting the future of our cities. Now, these might then become quite particular in how they actually act or impact upon an environment locally. But essentially, they're global trends that are changing the way we think about how we live, how we work, and the spaces that we inhabit. So the central theme of the projects today in the selection of the projects is really about the idea of a driver of change and how it has the potential to transform urban areas. And that is really about the changing nature of our relationship to work. Now, historically, 19th century, beginning of 19th century, pre-19th century, medieval cities, etc., had very deep blocks, and they were hollowed out really by a series of sequence of spaces, semi-private courts, semi-public spaces, yards, etc. And this actually allowed more adjacencies between what we did in work environment and how we lived. Yeah, the kind of blurring of domestic and employment or work. It's not working. It's strange. Should have gone through them. I went through the first three and then.
Yes. We just make a break and we sort it out because I also realized, go here. So I can fill the gap what I missed to say in the beginning. Sorry for that. But you established, I think, the office in '97 in the Netherlands, running offices now in London and Amsterdam. And Dominic is also teaching since quite a while, since years already at AA. Studied also there and teaching especially also on this kind of fringe of urbanism and housing, together with Florence Bard and Anna Shapiro. And I think we slowly get there. I see some more images now. Yes.
There you go. Now it didn't work when I was actually remote teaching, did it? Now I'm actually facing people. Everything goes wrong. Hopefully that's the only thing. So, you know, I think that sort of the way our cities were structured in the 19th century. And sometimes that was under the same roof as well. And so, you know, in the UK, you had Spitalfields, where house with workshop behind, people made gloves, etc., small artisan workers, etc. And this was made up a great deal of our city. And, you know, to some extent in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, you have the Achterhuis, which obviously everybody knows is the kind of secret annex of you know, where Anne Frank hid out, but also it was very much a structural element within the city, and actually how it was sort of the fabric of the city was really working. The front of the house gave space to employment, to warehouse, etc., the goods on the canal, and people were actually living in behind through the kind of transition of a patio. And so actually the domestic environment was sequestered, hidden away in the back of the large block. Now that changed, and that changed dramatically in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, because what happened is that through industrialization, there was a sort of mass exodus from the rural environment into the cities. And so hundreds and thousands of people moving into the city, and they were creating slums. They were all cohabiting in very bad conditions, many people in a room, etc. And so also there's a lack of privacy. There was overcrowding, and therefore obviously the conditions were very poor. And so as a kind of pendulum swing of reaction, what happened is that the reformers of the late 19th century started to gain force, gain power, in terms of really trying to split and segregate those two issues, you know, living and working. And as that gained ground, it became much more strictly regulated. And there was actually a lot of things that were prohibited. So all of a sudden, work-related activities were not allowed. And so we got this kind of schism where, and obviously that led to zoning laws, etc., in the beginning of the 20th century as well, where as industrialization took over, large amounts of people were then working in a building like a factory, and then everybody was living around it. And you can see in this image, you know, there's a very clear morphological definition here between where you work, they're big things, and where you live, they're small things. The problem is that everybody then lived on a street, and the street became the kind of the primary public space of the city. And what happened is that actually you ended up with the private world of the factory, the work, and the private world of the domestic. And so there was actually a lack of civic life within the city and within the structure of the city. Now, the problem is that as we fast forward, you know, 50, 60 years, you can see that the remnants of that structure are still in our cities, especially in the UK. And what you end up with is, you know, the street as the only real space of public realm. Can it actually handle the pressure of life today? And this is one of the issues, because actually what we're finding is that people still look for a kind of nostalgic idea of the high street. You know, they see that as the kind of the main civic realm, public space of our cities. Save our high street. And yet, look at it. I mean, you know, I think two pictures which I think are kind of very, very clear in the sense that pavements, roads, you know, it's basically a high street, is a thoroughfare with some buildings next to it. And then the people are squeezed into that street, that little bit of pavement in between. The buildings are like 5 meters wide, you know, and then they just repeat because they used to be part of an agricultural kind of field network, etc. Or it's just about getting a lot of frontage and therefore a lot of commercial activity onto the street. So they're not resilient. And as you can see, I mean, the retail world that we're living in now is changing. You know, we're having to rethink what do we put on our high streets now. And then you're getting actually the problems of traffic. You know, those two things just don't go together. And yet, you know, usually high streets are thoroughfares that lead out of cities. And so therefore they're being choked, literally, as you can see on the picture on the right there, by fumes. And so it's also about health and well-being. So these two things are progressively in conflict with how we nostalgically think about our cities and how it can really accommodate the kind of things that are changing. And I'll come to that in a minute. And so from a planning point of view, what happens is that we all think that buildings should create a perimeter. And there's a very clear definition between inside, outside, public, private, domestic, civic. And there's a central garden, and that's where everybody then can communally play. But the problem with that is it means that all our streets have to be really, really good. Every single one of those 4 streets that surround that block has to perform really well. And of course, I don't know about Vienna, but in London, there's a lot of streets that don't work very well. And it puts a lot of pressure on the green space, puts a lot of pressure on the street. And it's this idea, this Jane Jacobs idea that somehow street corners are good, the more the merrier, and front doors are, you know, somehow better. And the problem we're finding is that if we're trying to kind of follow that edict, then what happens is that as more and more kind of density is put onto these kind of small plots, then you're getting actually environments that are encumbered, and therefore you're not actually of high quality because we're putting more housing, more offices. You know, that garden gets squeezed and squeezed and squeezed and doesn't get any light and any real air quality. So I'm going to jump back to 1950, post-war, and for me, a kind of touch point in terms of a recalibration of that live-work environment. And the Eames, obviously, we can't all be the Eames because they're a unique couple. And you know, but for some reason, that blurring of live and work disappeared completely. You know, there was no distinction. And in a way, it was more like a kind of life in work rather than work and life, which was a lovely description. But, you know, their environment had no distinction between bedroom, kitchen, studio, dark room. There was just a slight articulation between 2 buildings that actually were across a courtyard. And the only kind of point of intimacy that they actually allowed into their house was a sofa that was set back in a little snug where they could sit together. That's the only point of intimacy in the plan. But I think it's a fascinating kind of starting point in the sense that, you know, because things are changing. And I think it's interesting that we're now moving through a kind of phase where technology, industry 4.0, but also the internet and the kind of interconnectivity of things means that we can be aware of where things are, how much we need of something on a kind of almost continuously updating environment. Yeah. So we don't have to like haul big things, store big things, because we can actually use small batch storage, last mile logistics, etc. Well, when it does arrive, obviously at the moment it's a bit difficult, but generally, as tech becomes cleaner, safer, you know, people can see here they're 3D, you know, manufacturing bespoke furniture from a CNC cutter sent through a software to a factory, and they can just build, you know, anything. 3D printing, all these kind of things. Machinery is getting smaller, cleaner. And so all of a sudden, those things that separated out live and work are potentially coming closer and closer. At the same time, the idea of cooperation, the idea of how we embed kind of institutions that support work are becoming more urbanized. And so what we're having is sharing spaces, co-working environments. We have last mile logistics. Healthcare is being integrated even more into our urban environments. We don't want them in big hospitals. We want health well-being. We want to be able to pop along to somewhere and discuss intimate things in a conducive environment. And so this idea of distributed care that's spread through our urban environments is becoming more progressive. And even crossovers between the idea that an engineering company and the Fab Lab in Manchester might at the weekends open up their workspace to teach people how they can repair things. So that if you have a broken machine or anything like that, you can go along, you can learn. So there's more crossovers between lifelong learning, education, and work. And so what we're finding is that also because of the kind of the speeding up of the way we work as well, the kind of, the fashion industry is the most unsustainable industry in the world, but it talks about the things that now we have 13 seasons of fashion, we don't have 4. So that means that you need to kind of prototype, you need to market, you need to design, all these kind of things. And also your customers and your suppliers need to be closer to you. And so all of a sudden, that idea of cooperation, collaboration, open source working means that you need to be in more high value areas, such as city centers, metropolitan centers. So innovation is happening quicker as well. And therefore, if we understand that our work and innovation is becoming more urbanized, more central to our cities, then we must recognize that actually our urban areas mobility and micromobility is really important in actually servicing that need. And also the emergence of a kind of civic and social network. And so parks, streets, outdoor environments are becoming much more part of a network of trust, where business is being extended beyond the architecture, the buildings that we inhabit, but is becoming part of a kind of daily routine. And those extend beyond the barriers of kind of 9 to 5, etc. Now, one of the interesting things we're seeing also is that supporting innovation is the formation of increasing number of institutions. And this harks back to associationism. There you go. Where, primarily it's a 19th century concept which really looked at sort of self-governing enterprises, really, that were basically as a kind of counterpart to state socialism. But what we're seeing now through kind of social enterprise is a similar kind of idea of filling in the gaps where government are failing. And so therefore, these institutions are being formed to bridge that gap. But also, they're seeing that there's an interesting gap in the sense between institution and the idea that you might actually reach out, but also bring in people. It could be through lifelong learning. It could be, so there's a kind of an idea that, children, etc., through to families on their lifelong learning through, can actually bring a kind of quality into the urban environment. Now, this is interesting because it talks about absorption. How can our urban environments then bring people in to architecture? It's not, the public realm does not then stop at the street. And so it's talking about a kind of support network that is allowing us to kind of form workspace-centered urbanism, but actually a kind of extension of that civic realm. And so the Wellcome Trust is a science lab with a kind of with an outreach program that looks at art and educational facilities. It's trying to train up the next scientists. So it's trying to draw people in from the ages of 7 and 10 and make their buildings open and porous. So it asks us to really rethink about what our cities are doing. You know, we look back at the Noli plan as a kind of permeable and public accessible realm, rather than drawing our buildings as solid things with space in between. And it's interesting when you look at, this is a drawing that we've made of King's Cross, or part of King's Cross, that starts to look at an emerging fabric, which looks at a station district that has absorptive potential. So all of a sudden, there's a kind of more diverse series of buildings, from warehouses to stations to institutions such as the Crick and the British Library, through to housing projects from the 70s. And they're all becoming part of a larger district that is actually a very diverse living and working environment, where you can move through the fabric of the actual architecture itself. So I'm not going to read this, but I thought I'd just put it up there because I think it's, in the case of video and looking at it later, and because obviously it's in English and I'm talking English tonight, you can think about it. But it just sort of, you know, talks about some of the emerging elements within workspace neighborhood and how urban life, you know, civic, recreational, residential, etc., is requiring more really about how we design pieces of our city. So if that perimeter block is actually becoming problematic, you know, this kind of overemphasis on a kind of 60 by 60 meter perimeter urban block, and we're realizing that actually, if productive parts of our city are going to be retained, then the problem is we can't fit that all into our cities. You know, there are big things. But we also have all the demands of our living environments, you know, bicycles, storage. Our flats are getting smaller, you know, we're getting more bikes, etc. So there's a lot more to go on the ground. There's a lot more to absorb. And yet our buildings aren't changing. You know, we still think there needs to be 4 streets around the perimeter. And there, you know, you can see there's the little sketch on the left there is that slight adjustment that's being made, and that was made in Hafen City. It's in master plan, where they started to open up the perimeter block to disassociate certain elements of it, so that you could actually think about a potential future of the building that is here being an office building or a different type of living, that actually there's a sequence of spaces rather than just one. And what we've tried to do is actually start to look at this and you know, keep moving in terms of exploring in the work that we do, how we can actually blur those boundaries between what is communal space, what is private, semi-private, semi-public, etc. Now, dimension becomes really important. And we've always said as a practice that form matters from a morphological point of view and a typological point of view. So dimension, orientation, all these things are critical. And there's work that we've done where we started to explore the changes and how, as you move through a kind of dimensional shift, what that does, what the potential that it actually brings. And you can see that, you know, when we look at cities such as Toronto, this is in King's Spadina in Toronto, you've got Berlin here, you've got Oerlikon in Zurich, and you've got Zurich West. Fascinating bits of city where really big things are occupying central parts of the city. They're becoming more diverse, where workspace, civic amenity, and residential are coming together. And it's really by understanding the kind of forms of the blocks. So in King's Spadina, it's actually a large but rectangular form, 70 by 140 meters, that allows actually to have consistency, but then actually movement through, porosity into the block. So, you know, the work that we look at is typological and morphological. And as I said, form matters, because there's a kind of malleability within that, inherent within their form. So the first project I wanted to talk about briefly was Scots 1 and 2, Swine. This is our European winning scheme. it's really started our kind of career in the Netherlands, really. And it was really looking at the city, or that part of the city, as a kind of filter zone, where we didn't want to distinguish necessarily too much. This is the competition between inside, outside, back and front, landscape, figure ground, etc. It's more like a kind of stained glass window. And it was interesting because it was actually on the kind of space in between the sort of the old part of the city, 17th century extension to the medieval city, but also then the 20th century kind of part, which was Berlage kind of master planned. And the battlements were formed around the kind of walled city, and now it's become a park. And the Saboga terrain was a large area that was used as a kind of gas factory and also a circus terrain, etc., and a wasteland, basically. So, you know, the architecture, we felt, had to retain those kind of qualities. And I think one of the things we want to do was actually understand how you could bring all these different things together into a series of urban blocks that actually started to open them up to what they called, the client called, a kind of parochial ruimte, which is a kind of parochial space. It's kind of in-between space that could be occupied by the local residents and the immediate community. And so we were really exploring a kind of an idea of circulation, idea of permeability, porosity, and kind of integrating it with the surrounding fabric in a way that opened up these from being hermetically kind of sealed into something that could work as a kind of multi-layered environment that accommodate housing, such as family houses on the ground, but we changed the way in which we thought about the ground. And so the ground was pleated up, and other services such as medical center, supermarket, etc., were folded underneath, and then sort of faced onto a commercial environment. So there's this kind of stacking of things, which then kind of differentiated a series of public and collective private spaces. And then we had landscape on top. And so you can see here on the left is an idea that underneath those stairs is actually the kind of the back of the supermarket. But it allowed you then to move through. So the block was differentiated. You had a courtyard of a sequence of courtyards of different scales, which also then diversified the type of housing. You had a townhouse on the right-hand side of the picture, 4-story. You had lofts. And then through the gap up there, you had 2.5-story houses with a patio and a garden. And so you can see here, there's a kind of, what it allowed the buildings to do was to actually accommodate the intricacies of the edges of the site, fine grain housing, but also then city center, large scale elements such as shopping, medical facilities, etc., and storage. And so here, they open up and create then a central space through the middle. There was a kind of commercial, 100% commercial kind of environment, because the housing was being actually accessed from the rear. So this kind of pleated talud, you could actually come up on top of the supermarket, and you had your front door here. So 100% front doors, just like the perimeter housing, but then 100% commercial on the street side. And so it was articulating, what we try to do was have it make a background, a kind of framework for articulating new forms of life. And it's interesting, over the years to see how people have occupied the environment. The Dutch are very good at getting out there in their swimming pools and just inhabiting space. A bit of DIY down at the local B&Q, and they just buy stuff and they make it and they take it over. And I think that's one of the kind of nice things about working in an environment like this. And so you're getting, a set of different spaces within 2 urban blocks. Got to have a picture of bicycles for a Dutch project. Now, this is actually something that's on site right now. And this is, again, it's looking at how you might take a tight perimeter building and think about in the confines of another city like London. The land is obviously really expensive, highly valued. and therefore you have minimal kind of opportunity really for opening that up like we were in Groningen. But what we're doing here is really trying to, let's say, almost layer space through the building itself. So all of a sudden, rather than opening up morphologically in plan, this is actually then opening up in section, and it's pulling back and creating communal spaces and private spaces, generous outdoor environments, which post-pandemic is becoming obviously even more valuable, that people want outdoor space. How can you do that in a city like London, where density is ridiculously high? At the same time, you know, the building, although courtyard in plan, is actually an extension of a work environment. So all of these arches going all the way out of London Bridge, which is on the south side of the river, where the Shard is, that's actually a whole series of artisan workshops where they make bread, beer, honey, chocolate, and then they sell it out front at the weekends. Yeah, so you have a very minimal point of sale at the front, but this is part of the whole makers economy, yeah, where that blurring between making and commercial life and also domestic life is changing. And so the life of those arches is coming in, and we're responding to that. So our building is actually, you know, setting back, creating a kind of space that will become what we call the low line. We can't afford a high line. And then bringing some of those qualities into the urban block itself, opening it up, and opening it up in other ways as well. So there's a play space that becomes a kind of visual link between the street and the courtyard. There's a number of openings, obviously, to enter the building, but also then you're getting the kind of the workspace coming up into the building as well. So it's trying to sort of engage within that kind of economy, of makers economy, within the form of the building. And so you can see here, these are the arches, the kind of activities that are happening in the arches, and the building is responding to that through opening up one side. And then using transparency in a way to engage within street life as well. So the courtyard is not just, you know, kind of sealed within a kind of overly private environment, but is seen as a kind of relationship between the kind of the civic life of the street and the interior. So that's a view going down the arches through here, and then the life of the arches is coming into the building, and then the impact of the small site, and therefore, you know, the terraces, communal and private, and then sort of stacking up the building themselves. Now we get even smaller. Yeah, so now we're actually taking that urban form and compacting it even more. Now this is a mixed-use project in China. It took 12 months to design and build it. And these are pictures of it that we just finished. But there was it's interesting for us because it was a very strange building that needed to actually work for an emerging community. You had to have office space, it had to have hosting spaces, it had to have retail, shopping environment, obviously for the emerging community, but at the same time, be an attractive kind of hub for that emerging community. And what we didn't want to do was, if we stuck it all in one corner, then you ended up with these vast open spaces that are kind of, you know, not very habitable, but also undifferentiated. And so what we did was we spread that program over a larger area and layered it so that you get a kind of sectional relationship between office space on the top, retail, community facilities in the middle, and then with landscape coming into the building and forming spaces that could be seen as places the community could meet. And I remember a building in Stamford where everybody was standing around the first floor balcony and they were having a meeting, an outdoor meeting. And this is something that inspired us in this building. That there was this idea that you could actually have group meetings within the kind of form of the building. And then in between, sandwiched was a kind of series of hosting spaces, marketing, etc., to sell things, sell houses as the community was emerging. So again, this is different in the sense it layers vertically and creates this kind of tripartite relationship between three different environments, and then allowing landscape to come in and be differentiated as well. So rather than just having large plazas around a very kind of compact building, we felt that mitigating against climate, heat, etc., very sort of very sort of shifts between 50 degrees in the summer and minus 20 in the winter, then trying to create those kind of spaces that actually can be occupied throughout the year. So you can see here there's the kind of the mezzanine sort of hosting spaces, bars, cafe terraces. You've got the landscape coming through into the kind of shopping area, and then you've got hosting and workspace above. Now, as we start to explore beyond the perimeter, this idea of urban form, and we look at things like the linear block, and we look at things also such as the point block, there's certain advantages when we look at ways in which we can accommodate live, work, employment, and the domestic environment in our cities. I think the linear block is interesting because it has a kind of frontality to it. There's a kind of sequencing. You can move through layers. You can have a very kind of street-facing frontal relationship, but then it can actually go through sequences of privacy and communality as you move through the block. And you see that, a big yard is one in Berlin, and you get that in larger developments as well as you can move through. And in a way, the Berlin block had that kind of sequencing through. So if you take a small section of the Berlin block, you could actually have workspaces at the back and housing at the front, and it could be through a series of courtyards. But I think the morphological kind of type of what we find in Paris, in Messina, in the left bank, is very interesting. And this is a kind of diagram that starts to talk about that. This ability that you can actually bring a whole number of things to bear on an urban block. Big things, podium, the idea of the tower as something that has very little impact on the ground. And in that sense, it's good, because the last thing that people want in a work environment is all the residential stuff coming down through the building. So it's not very flexible. All it does is give you some very small workspaces, because you've got the stairs, the lifts, the doors, the bikes, the bins, and all those kind of things. And so the idea of the kind of îlot vert, as Christian Poulsen Park describes it, is one which opens it up to actually allow it to give you the potential to deliver a whole number of things. And actually, there's a kind of hybridity to it. So therefore, typologically, it can actually be quite diverse. And I think it's interesting that there are emerging certain things where this idea of clustering, this idea of permeability, means that the block can open up at different scales. So Central St. Giles, I think the diagram is interesting. It's not very interesting architecture, but the diagram is interesting from Renzo Piano, where it's seen as a kind of filtering space in the city, where it moves through as a kind of connection and linkage between two parts of London. Soho, Covent Garden, and then sort of what they call Midtown. The Architectural Association is just here. So therefore you're getting a kind of expansive civic environment that actually becomes then a place where things can be curated and set in place, so that people can move through it, but they can also stand there and they can be stationary and enjoy activity. And there's a kind of transparency, a kind of an orientation that allows then to be understood as a kind of nexus within the city. And then going back to Messina in Rive Gauche, that idea that there is a kind of layering, and the block is open in the sense that you know, here you've got housing, but it's actually off the ground. The studio's plugged in underneath. There's a garden. Then there's a kind of one-story building here with a cafe. You know, so there's a real mix morphologically around what the architecture can do and how it can then be flexible and how it sort of starts to offer more and bring broader impact and benefits to the wider city. And in a sense, that's what architecture needs to do. And this is where the link between architecture and urbanism is critical for me. That whatever we build, we need to understand it as bringing wider benefits and actually setting out a role for the street, you know, a role for the spaces around it. And the perimeter block doesn't do that. It isolates itself. And of course, from a development point of view, it's a kind of exit strategy. You don't have to think about it. You put the streets down and then you just build. We talked about the linear block, the slab. And I think what's interesting about Neo by Richard Rogers, or Roger Sturck-Harbour now, is that it gives a very clear orientation in the city, but also the ground is doing something very different. It's quite rich in the sense that the buildings don't come to the ground completely, but the garden sometimes moves underneath the building, but only half of it. So sometimes you can slip between the buildings. Sometimes you can slip slightly underneath it. And so there's a kind of what we call a thickened ground, but there's a kind of slight slippage and braiding between how one moves, how one builds the architecture and how one moves through the urban environment. And we talk about resilience and we talk about how we can accommodate working environments in our cities. And I think one of the interesting things here is, if I show these two pictures, they're almost the same kind of space. Dimensionally, in section, in plan, timber, double height, first floor mezzanine glazed space in the background, light coming from high, and an open central interior. One is a primary school, the other one isn't. Don't play with the machines, Johnny. So, you know, the ones make stuff. And yet, you know, both are embedded within an urban block with residential, either above it or adjacent to it. And so that kind of resilience and that kind of understanding of how type can allow us to think about different potential futures for our city is important, you know, and I would argue that it's not there within the way we plan our cities at the moment. And I'm not talking about flexibility in a kind of woolly, wishy-washy kind of way where it can be anything. This is actually typologically specific, but functionally flexible. And so all of a sudden, you know, that the kind of civic quality of our cities is starting to move in and out. Yeah, Local Tilburg, you know, obviously it's a fantastically handsome, generous kind of industrial space. But that ability to kind of move in and out is something that we can explore. And these are the kind of things that started to, you know, shape the way we think about new parts of the city. So there's a competition we were doing in the Olympic Park. And we were asked to look at a kind of a living environment that actually brought some of the whole manufacturing artists, studios and maker spaces of Hackney, Wick, next door into that environment. And so we were looking at actually in a kind of expanded urban grain that would allow, you know, this is Hackney Wick here, full of small factories and artist studios, etc. 19th century fabric. And then the Olympic Park. And we were looking at these two blocks here, which is Eastwick. And there's the Olympic Stadium down here. And, you know, what you looking back at this idea of yards and understanding how they performed, not necessarily from a kind of pastiche way, but this idea of how you cluster buildings, understand how they actually how they work how they orientate, how the entrances, and their transparency and their organizational kind of structure allows them to perform not just as a collection of buildings, but they work together inside out. And this is what we mean by cluster. There's a kind of permeability and porosity, but at the same time, they work together. And so, trying to understand how then that might then shape a way in which we think about the city. Looking in detail at the section and how that might be used to perform a whole series of different roles in actually activating the street, but also activating the interior or the other type of space. We had these two. We had a residential yard and we had a work yard, and yet there was a symbiotic relationship between them. And so that allows us to explore, a kind of openness, but actually a way in which you might structure life within an environment where you could bring both of those together. Now, we took that a step further in Bulrush, where we were really trying to get the commitment for the next step in an innovation environment up in northeast London. And this was really about sort of making the most of a kind of workspace workshop employment zone, but actually then allowing it to expand into something that would actually bring around a kind of real relationship between live and work. So there was social housing, and as soon as you're on that social housing list, you got access to another list, which was actually about workspace. And so there's a link here between the people that live there and the people that work there. So there's a broad range of artisan studios, but also big manufacturing, next to some of the larger manufacturing that already existed. And again, this is where, the idea of the point block became evident as being able to support that kind of diversity. But challenging in the sense that although it was trying to connect two parts of this part of London, which weren't connected through a kind of diagonal route, it was challenging in a way to actually see how it could be serviced, trucks, etc., but also cycles. So this idea that, you can move through it as a pedestrian this way, but actually you move through it this way if you're actually in a truck. And so there was a kind of meshing, a kind of gridding of the environment that was set out through a kind of landscape approach. And then that landscape approach then came up through onto the top of the buildings as well. So it allowed us to kind of, the block then opened up even more, right next to a tube station, lots of people moving through. And in the middle of it was this kind of hub building of workspace, open plan, where people could congregate, hosting, education, and support amenities for a kind of a broadening kind of employment base. And so you got that very clear route through, very kind of clear, legible orientation. And then workspaces were to the sides, where there was sequestered certain types of environments. And working with Uta and her team, we were looking at something similar in terms of, let's say, scope, but actually in scale of another completely different kind of point. And this was really delivering like 4 million square meters of space in Singapore for a new district as a kind of alternative to the CBD. And I'm not going to go into the whole project, but it was really about the way in which we started to really think about how we can structure an environment that would support living and working. And it was interesting, we were, thinking back around even some of the kind of more mature historic environments of those cities, delivering differentiated networks. And it was, Soho works so well as a space that can compete globally in terms of media tech through, small studios that collaborate. They come out of a 3-story house, they walk across and go into another 3-story house. And basements are connected. It works almost as a kind of complete sort of economic cluster in itself, but within a kind of gridded urban form. It used to still manage to actually then support a porn industry, and at the same time, people were living there. I'm not advocating that every city centre should have that, but one or two of those things are important, and it's not the porn industry. So, you can see here that there's this kind of layering of the block where living environments behind are actually then supporting the vibrancy of this of the employment, which is actually, funnily enough, reversed here, because the small spaces are actually the employment spaces, small media studios. And we're seeing it, expand to things like in Brooklyn Navy Yards, 150,000 square meters of mixed use, where living and light industry is co-located. But what we started to do with ourselves and KCAP was looking at how we might rethink and reconceptualize streetscape and block morphology, moving away from the isolated blocks in Singapore, podium, tower, repeat, repeat, repeat. So moving into something which is talking about clusters and how they work together rather than just a kind of barren street environment. And so there's this idea of moving away from those blocks to something that used to be able to kind of expand across those to create a much more integrated environment. And as soon as you expand the confines of that urban form, then you can actually start to think about spaces such as the ones you see here. That's Sacla in Paris by Omar. You've got ANZ in Melbourne there on the top right, where the buildings are so large, they start to actually then form and diversify how the street. So in a sense, the street could be almost left to be a kind of green space completely, where the civic life of the city could be expanded and absorbed into the block itself. And at the same time, still allow a residential community to be co-located through the kind of dimension of the block. Materiality becomes important. Legibility becomes important, transparency, etc. And I'll come back to some of those other things a bit. And so there was a kind of, illustration, a kind of potential future for a block that could form a whole diverse number of roles within the urban fabric, as a kind of test for what the larger district could actually offer. Now, I don't know how long I've got actually, but I've done an hour already, have I? Okay.
Not really.
I'm going to race through the next bit then, because I was told not to be longer than an hour. But I think it's important that if we are thinking about metropolitan region as a complex form, and actually it's trying to then support a growing need for network-driven innovation, then, what does that do? And how can we then think about how that might affect larger environments where these kind of companies could start to group together? And it's something that we've been looking at in Singapore. And of course, what we understand from Singapore is that, in an innovation-led economy, they've gone through almost like 4 generations now. And the problem is that some of those environments are first generation, and similar to Silicon Valley. Dead boxes, innovations on the inside, it's protected. It's secret. We park our car, we go in there at 9 o'clock in the morning and we leave at 6. Okay, nobody knows what we're doing because it's secret. We don't talk to anybody. Now that's changing. We've just talked about the fact that, open source innovation, collaboration, cooperation is critical within the innovation environment. You can't have innovation without cooperation. And so therefore people want to be closer together. They want to be next to high quality environments. They want to attract new talent. And so how do they do that? Now the problem is, as we all expect from our cities, we expect that integration to happen through high quality park spaces, high quality civic environments, etc. And that's, in Singapore is through a kind of an emerging kind of district And we looked at One North and also Singapore Science Park 1 and 2 as well. And I'll come back to this in a minute. But this is what they have. You know, a road. Somebody walking along a street, squeezed between a road and a green space that the city has no control over because it's run by a completely different organization. The buildings facing the street are just blank with car parking. And in between them is green. But it's kind of like it's just like somebody's put a felt tip over it. It's just green. And it's a buffer. It's a barrier. That's all it is. And so we've been looking at these kind of three spatial structuring elements based around an idea that we think that architecture, circulation, landscape are critical as a kind of central concept. They come together. You can't divide them. Lines of integration, when we talk about the campus as a kind of strategy, landscape as an integrator, and clusters. We've talked about that a little bit before, this idea of connected buildings, and thickened ground, this idea of a kind of inside-outside. So how can we bring, working, playing, learning, and a commitment to social spaces between buildings? And this is being supported by other, sort of transport infrastructure kind of expansion in Singapore as well. But what you're left with is science parks that are basically a street, what we call spine and spur, which then accesses each plot, has a building, has its own car park, has its own landscape, has its own front door. You come out and then you go back onto the street, and that's just a road. Okay, and now the idea is we want to move something towards this, where we're offering kind of pathways and active spaces that link at greater scale and greater extent beyond the realm of the actual architecture itself. And so we were looking at a kind of master plan, and this is just part of that. And it started to structure, again, talking about buildings having a kind of wider impact and benefit, was that we were looking at how we could structure a master plan around value. So one was really about establishing a presence on the street, giving a role to the street rather than it just being an infrastructure kind of vector. We were looking at actually this idea of clustering through establishing a kind of terrace that would then give a hierarchical kind of relationship to front doors, entrances, collective spaces, etc. We looked at distribution of courtyards and plazas, and we looked at the role of mini pavilions and amenities. And the mini roles, what was interesting is that the big buildings, small buildings. The small buildings played a critical role because they could do faster feedback loops. You build one, doesn't work, you knock it down. Yeah, the big one's still there. You have an amenity, you have something there. It could be a creche, a pharmacy, an F&B, a food and beverage, a restaurant, a bar. It can go, disappear in a year. Change, yeah, that's quick. So there's sort of, the building is working at two scales. One is working at a kind of fast feedback loop. The other one is there for a long time. And they're informing each other. And then this idea of topography and orientation through lines of integration were really critical. How you might move through space and link different buildings. So the lobby became not a showpiece, it became a kind of critical element in how the building was performing. And we've done this in other projects across the street, One North, where we're looking at this idea of progressive allure, this idea that you might sort of always want to know what's around the corner. So we're looking at this kind of bent grid. And that started to structure, not only the kind of gridness, but actually also moments of confluence where you might have activity and intensity. Because in these kind of environments, it's not a city center environment. You're having to put a few things in the right place and actually still be able to kind of draw a kind of vitality. And so, the way in which down to the architecture, then you're actually trying to define with those kind of progressive allure lines of integration, you're drawing program, event, amenity, activity, synergy through particular moments in the plan. inside outside, the way in which it starts to move through and amongst buildings was critical, and landscape becomes that integrator. And so it can't be just this kind of green felt tip. Those moments of how it might come together or not, in terms of actually how it might then work in a way that doesn't cross, but actually then shears, means that it starts to then create moments in the plan where you might bring things together. It stops things, it holds things, rather than actually the crossroads, which lets things go. And so therefore, you know, the first series of photographs of Singapore that look like this is actually trying to then inform how architecture and urbanism can start to then structure environments that are conducive to that kind of idea of collegiate environment. And we learned from looking at Berkeley a very complex structure. And I won't go into it now because I know I'm running out of time, but you know, this idea of how the grid shears, stops, and how landscape is differentiated, and how that sets up an ability to be moving from formal to informal. And even the canopy of the trees becomes another layer within that kind of richness. For us, we learned a lot from, and how we might structure urban environments through a kind of campus organization, in a way in which you're bringing mobility through and connecting things through landscape. Which, you know, for another project in Guangzhou, we're actually creating a kind of richness about how you might integrate innovation, workspace, office space, park, and residential compound into a kind of multi-layered landscape. So I just want to finish quickly on a project we finished in Singapore a couple of years ago, where we could actually start to build some of the things that we were looking at in the master plans. And it really was the kind of first phase of the Singapore Science Park. And this is where we started kind of trying to understand how we could structure something that would then take Science Park Drive, that road, that horrible road with the car and the people. We proliferated it through a kind of braiding. And so there was a whole series of different environments that ran parallel to it. One that could then take benefit from the conditions of a very long site with, you know, a garden side and an escarpment on Kent Ridge, the kind of Science Park Drive itself, the future cluster, the street, and then also an interior kind of vector, which will then be differentiated for times of the year, which could allow wind to come through and ventilate naturally the environment. To then would allow the disposition of elements and potential uses, and then potentially then link across Science Park Drive to Cluster 1, which is now, I think, been finished by Chris Lee from Siri Architects, colleague and friend. And so then, yeah, understanding how the building might be the starting point for a wider integration. And so we thought of the building in two parts. One was really hardworking. It delivered all the stuff the client wanted. You know, 8,000 square meter floor plates, 5 of them, you know, sort of life science, lab, office space. And then this thickened ground, this kind of mediating point in the plan, which was 9 meters high, could accommodate all the other stuff that supported the risky kind of vocation of innovation, by actually saying, well, you know what, you can actually rent a small space upstairs, and we can actually have all this other space you could share. An idea of a kind of clubhouse, hosting, meeting spaces, etc., that could be flexible in terms of actually how you use it and how you pay for it. And this was to have a kind of relationship to the landscape. And so the lobby, the topography, the way in which you move through, the small scale amenities that could change very quickly, lightweight, and then an idea of a braided pedestrian movement along the plan and across the plan to give distinct kind of workspace environments. And then you got the hard-working thing. And, you know, there's an idea that maybe you don't need planning for the 5 floors. You know, it's a standard thing. And then it's actually, you put all your effort into the 9 meters below. What we did do was we actually then took the slab and we then bent it, because we wanted to pull it back and allow a hosting space to come to the street, and then bring it back forward to then present the lobby to the street further down. The pavilions were set as a kind of cluster, as a kind of entry sequence. And then that set a kind of an idea of amenity, an outdoor space as a kind of fluid kind of environment. And then the building came away and back and then came to the street. And then you got this kind of layered environment. So as you look down Singapore Science Drive, you can get actually the lobby and the layering as a kind of frontal relationship. So the building is responding, the architecture is responding and structuring the way in which the future of the science park might develop. So you're getting cross flow, long flow, and you're getting a series of different spaces that then braid through the plan. An idea of transparency, front to back. An idea of back to front, and this idea of always being able to see through a series of co-working hosting spaces, alumni club, that there's this kind of relationship always with a kind of landscape and a streetscape. And then that braiding works so that you can approach the building at an angle. You can then tuck next to it and have an intimate meeting. All of a sudden, those spaces then are up higher and then come into the building and extend like a terrace. They then pull up against the building, you're sheltered. So in the rain, you can still be outside, have a meeting, etc. And you can also walk in the sunshine, 50 degrees. And then there's immediacy, you know what's going on inside. So there's a transparency. And then that transparency moves to a kind of an interior, which then can accommodate a whole number of things. It moves out back, it goes through, and then allows all the dirty stuff, the drop off, the parking, and landscape as a kind of series of hosting spaces that then cascade up the hill. So can we see a future? I ran through that quickly. Can we see the future where our buildings can be more complex? We think about our cities much more diverse and differentiated. Can we think about urbanism as something that actually allows us to drive a new way in which we can think about the relationship between how we work and how we live? And can we accommodate those in our city centre? And that's something that, we're striving, and we're working in design and we're working in policy as well in Belgium and Netherlands, and also in London. We've been part of research papers, etc., that start to look at this and how this might be moved forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that rich and full lecture. First questions from the ground, because otherwise we go into discussion from the hall. For me, it was now really interesting. Maybe you just have take a seat.
There's somebody there,
you in the middle. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Hand up.
Sorry.
How do you see retail? Like we had first picture, your initial picture was about retail on the ground floor. And, how do you see the future of retail? I've seen a lot of pictures in your presentation about ground floors. Like I would say 80% of your pictures show ground floors, and then there are all the plan drawings. But how do you see the function of retail in combination with all the other functions that you used for your ground floor designs? Like, because traditionally it was all retail space.
Yeah.
I think we have to go to the mic.
Yeah.
And if let's bring that mic.
Nope. Am I sitting here? Am I sitting there?
Where you want?
Might as well look at the 8 people. Well, the problem is actually that retail's dying, or it's changing. So I don't know about here in Vienna, but in London, we're in a bit of a poor state. It's not sustainable. And I think the problem is now is also people haven't been able to move quick enough, post-pandemic, but also it's happening. I mean, all these trends were happening pre-pandemic, they just got accelerated. And so, years ago, there was department stores were shutting. People are buying online. Or they actually go, what you're seeing now is that you'll get this kind of shift where you'll get a place like an emporium or a kind of showroom, an experience you go to, and then you go home and order it. Mm-hmm. And so I think it will shrink. I think what we'll find is that we're not going to have cities which are those high streets, shop. It's not going to work. First of all, they're too small. So the high streets are problematic. The urban form of the high street is problematic because it doesn't allow anything big, small, or anything to move behind it. It's just all properties along a road that's moving somewhere else. And that is too constrained. It's not robust enough. It's not resilient enough as an urban form. So high street is a specific kind of example because it's actually very restrictive. But I think generally, shopping, it's going to have to change. It's going to shrink, and we're going to have to find other things to occupy our high streets. And I think shops retail will come, but it will come and go. It'll be highly curated. It'll be pop-up, and it will just move, and it will change because this month we like cheese. Next month, we like beer. I know that's probably not true. I think beer will be around a lot longer. But, what was interesting was that the pubs that survived in the UK in the pandemic were the ones that started to do other things. So, there's a butcher who then became a pub, or a pub that sold cheese. They started to sell things. And so they're having to be more nimble, flexible, and be more reactive and proactive in adjusting to something that I think was always coming. I think we've just seen it accelerate exponentially. So I think it's not, I've been looking at the ground because I think we need to look at the ground. We're not Singapore, and I didn't show some of the images that, KCAP and us did because it was so kind of stacked, gardens in the sky and stuff. It's only Singapore. But I think what I wanted to try and talk about was the public realm, the civic environment, as something that can be absorbed into building. Obviously, you saw locale, it can be up 3-4 stories. But it's this idea that we need to rethink how we see the ground. Mm. It's not just the space between a building anymore. And our cities need to be absorptive so it can give you more access. The idea is you don't have less space. You have more ability to think about how it can be used in the best way.
Yeah, I think there was quite some very interesting. You had several kind of. First of all, there was a kind of similarity of wording. We had also last time inside out, outside in, which is you use this a lot, but also on, let's say, the drawings now for Asian in Singapore, the last building, and also urban blocks kind of, and also even shots, looking into that layering. And looking into, let's say, the first levels of a building, there is a kind of a landscape, whether it's a staircase or a podium, kind of the slope that goes through. But and you were also talking a lot about working together, clusters. And I think that goes through an urban block as well as through a building, and informs very much, let's say, the work. And I think also I like a hybrid and multifunctional city, kind of how much program we can really kind of radical mix in a way, because a high street is also mono, and there's only that to fill in. And I think this, and you were also speaking a lot about porosity, and there's exposure, but also intimacy. And even buildings in a cluster have an outside and inside and work together. And I think this informs, let's say, your work, but also kind of the work we saw last time. Kind of, it's really this looking into much more complex layering kind of programs than this kind of monofunctional that is just only possible to fill in by one function. And it's not, you named it resilience. We call it very often robust. These typologies, they can really inhabit a lot of different functions. And if it's very, very dedicated, in my opinion, then we are not and it's not flexible anymore to fill in differently. And I think this layering juxtaposition of a lot of different programs, especially on the first levels, on this kind of human scale, seems to me highly important in your work through all scales.
Yeah, I think we've always been interested in typology. It's a kind of that structures, that sort of light and dark, open, closed, something that has specificity in terms of how it organizes spaces. Because, I'm not talking about building a shed. Although, interestingly, it's interesting to see how sheds are becoming more articulated. We get schools in sheds now. I don't know whether you've got them here, but because it's cheap, why you don't need a facade. You just need to have a kind of central atrium, central auditorium or space. So, you can fit things in sheds, and obviously Locale is doing that as well. And there's a space in the city for that, and you see it in Zurich West. So I think we're just trying to, it's about diversity. It's about saying that, within a, and that's something we're exploring, within a kind of fabric of the city, it's not complexity for the sake of complexity, but it's this idea that we need to think about typology. There needs to be some amount of consistency. So I think one of the questions we're asking ourselves is, how much do you need of one thing? And it's something we explored in One North. We're not saying that every building should be different, one next to another, next to another, next to another, because then you don't create identity or legibility of a city. Because I think what we like about our cities right now is, we know that Soho is Soho because it's distinct from another district. So there's a balance here to play between how we recognize bits of our city. That's where all those lovely little buildings are. This is, we that's how we talk and we find our way around the city. But I'm just saying is that we need to, even within the morphological grain of the fabric, there can be complexity within that. So it can be morphologically consistent, but typologically distinct. And I think in a way you did that in Hafen City, very well, in the sense that you had a series of buildings on the quayside, 45 by 50 or 55 by 50. And yet one could be living, one could be working. One was living and working, Rolandsbruch something, shared, completely same floor plate, just one side was working. It had a diagrid. That was the only thing that really told you that it was a working environment, had more transparency. But, they were morphologically consistent, but actually typologically different in the sense that it allowed all these different things to happen. And created, all the same building, pretty much, very much part of a family of buildings. So I think the complexity is in the way in which you can allow that to happen. How do we then set in place the city to allow us to then, accommodate that change?
Yeah, is it not very often much more kind of in the problematic of the, let's say, the urban rule and programmatic rules, and these things? Because, let's say, I like to phrase it differently, not complexity, but maybe richness of different kind of program. And are we capable, or kind of are urban regulations, legal regulations allowing this kind of richness? And I think that is very often kind of the typologies should be flexible enough to inhabit different kind of uses, but very often we are not allowed to do that.
Well, what we're seeing now is that at the moment we're looking at a kind of large scheme in north of King's Cross, which is the sketch at the end, which is still secret, which is obviously not. And
Screamed.
So, we're trying to move away from, obviously zoning is something I talked about at the beginning, and the problems of that segregation. And we know that, in certain economies like China, etc., they do that in a way to slow development down, because otherwise it will happen so quickly. There's no control mechanism. So although we talk about it being a problem in China, I think I understand what they're doing in a kind of paternal way of trying to kind of sustain, a kind of to stop that kind of free fall. Although we looked at it in One North as being sort of kind of micro zoning. But I think we're talking about activities now, and actually what's happening is not talking about use, but activity. Because, as I said, you could be making bread and then selling it, right, in the front room. You could You can be prototyping in your living room. You know, sort of all of these things are possible. 3D printing in your backyard. And so all of a sudden, you know, we've actually just last year in 2020, they introduced a new planning thing, which actually brought together a whole number of things together into one thing. So we have A, B, C, D. And it's like, you know, commercial, retail, etc. There's business and office and light industrial, and then there's hospitality and living and etc. Yeah, and there's community and culture. But actually, there's a number of them, A, B, and I think some D, that they brought together into what's called E. So in a sense, you can bring all these activities together under one umbrella, because we realize that actually it's being too prescriptive to separate these things out. And because there is much more desire for co-location. And so those regulations now are interestingly trying to follow suit to allow that to happen. Now, where that goes, you know, it'd be interesting to see, and we're dealing with it at the moment.
I found the lecture quite interesting from a Viennese point of view, because in Vienna, when we're talking about what constitutes a city or how we build up new urban developments, we almost exclusively talk about housing, because that's the Viennese tradition. And we never talk about all these things which you showed, and you showed us. So everything that we never talk about here, working or other kinds of activities. I mean, not never, but almost.
It's very strongly monofunctional.
Yeah, yeah. So it's completely different tradition. I think it's quite urgent that we sort of lots of people should actually should look at this. But I was another question. Step back from the actual projects. I was just wondering from how you set up your practice, which I found intriguing. These two places, like two English guys in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands with this long tradition of everything being public and being discussed publicly, social housing, and London and the UK where everything is private and privately developed. And that's almost the idea that this sort of layering, which you do in lots of your projects, maybe comes from there, from your bringing these things, these traditions
that's
together.
That warm fuzzy bit.
It's fuzzy, but I don't know. That's sort of the theory. I don't know if that's true, but I don't know how this is working in these two very different environments influence.
Yeah, and it definitely. I mean, I think, you know, decade in the Netherlands, and I was working with Wheeler X 7 years before that. Decade of our practice in the Netherlands, you know, as the kind of main space for working. Yes, definitely, we were, you know, it was kind of like a kindred spirit finding a home, and you know, the fact that the disciplines are so blurred, and the discussion is always about everything together, because they have to, you know, and if it doesn't work, change it. And this is kind of, you know, there's no nostalgia, although obviously that has come in the decades to follow. But when we were there in, you know, sort of early 90s, when we started there, is that, you know, if there was a kind of pragmatic quality about it, which I still see through our work. It's what we call pragmatic enlightenism. You know, you kind of, it's being experimental and explorative, but within a very confined and very understanding, you know, idea about cost and all those kind of really dull things. But within there, you could go for hell, yeah. And you know, London, England is completely different, and that's what that's our challenge, you know. But that's also why we, in a way, somebody said to us, said, "I've never thought about you as an English practice. You know, you're a global practice that just happens to be located in the UK at this time," which is a nice way of saying something.
Yeah, but I think, let's say, what was for me also interesting, also for instance in Asian building, kind of how you, on one hand, this kind of combining the Dutch pragmatism with the conceptual kind of visionary kind of thinking, and that comes together. And how you treated, for instance, the space now in Asian, kind of the grade levels and the kind of the podium, so to say, or the first 2 or 3 levels, reminded me a little bit to Minand as well. You know, very pragmatic. His partner was working in the office I used to work for a long time, and it's very, very pragmatic to a certain extent, kind of on top level university building. And there is this kind of this kind of maneuver space you challenge to a maximum kind of to get the spatial quality into a building. And I think this is a bit what is in there. But what I found also pretty interesting to see is also this constantly, you spoke a lot about together, but also it's always a dialogue. This building in Ningbo found very, very interesting how much it goes into a dialogue between inside and outside, different kind of courtyards, different kind of niches. A lot of niches, and I think even in Schots there were already niches, but also these differentiations where I never kind of find the right English word for kind of the differentiation between circular space or transition space and space to stay in, which in German kind of you have the Ortraum and the Wegraum, and you play a lot with that as well. And I think there's also kind of something that comes from this, creating niches for different kind of people, but also getting into dialogue with your context. So it's not, this building is on one hand creating an intimacy, but also floating, and kind of creating niches to different kind of sites.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that actually. I'm just trying, there is a certain aspect where, I suppose it's coming from that Dutch pragmatist side, but also understanding that in a way that the UK is also problematic in a similar way. And this is why I walk around Vienna and just walk around the Gleis and saying, all these lots of different things going on here, and architecture in London is about that thin. Well, actually, it's about that thing, but because UV value, the U values for the insulation obviously is, but our facades are that thin. And yet, some people will spend hours, days, months trying to articulate that to a point where it becomes this beautifully crafted kind of vernacular, yeah. And I suppose what we do is, actually, it's that thin. We won't get it that thin. We're going to get it that thick. We get that thin. So we leave it like, but then we'll do something that actually is an urban move. We put all our money into that stuff. So, and I think you see that in certain places. I mean, King's Cross, I think, is a very interesting environment that's emerging over a long time. But the way in which the nooks and the crannies accept corners, they reorientate the building. You enter from the side rather than the front, the space of the lobby extends, and there's a covering, and then there's, it's bringing the space in. You don't see that a lot, and it's exceptional. It's sad that actually I'm still talking about King's Cross as the place to go. It's 20 years old, and we're not very good in the UK. We're not very good at actually delivering high quality environments. But I think yes, we tend to sort of say, right, there's an urban move, and that move tends to be slightly bigger scale, but then understands how it's working with context and a kind of larger diagram, really. And that's why I think working always between 1 to 5, 1 to 50, 1 to 5,000, 1 to 500 is how we work. We're in a way we scale this. When we sketch, it's quick, and it's something that is the scale of a district, but then that will be encapsulated within something at the scale of 1 to 500.
Well, one question about this is these nooks and crannies you're talking about, or this breaking up of the perimeter block, this sort of blurring the difference or the border between the public and the private, which I find quite interesting. I was wondering, because you also, I think, briefly showed the Renzo Piano project, St. Giles, which I think is actually a completely private space. But how relevant is it who owns the ground? Which ground is owned publicly and privately? Because you can blur the actual spaces, but then you have owners of these spaces, which sort of
privately owned public space, POPs.
Yeah.
And it's a big discussion. And I think, there's bad examples and good examples. The problem is that the state doesn't have the ability to, from where I work in London, it doesn't have enough to actually then care for, curate, manage, maintain, etc. There's a park near me that basically is being shut at night and opened in the morning by residents because they haven't got enough people to come around and open it. So yes, of course, ideally, coming from a kind of Dutch environment, you know, and the kind of the social good of everyone. And, you know, I lived in Copenhagen for a long time as well as a child. All that stuff is there for the social benefit of the larger public. The UK, though, I think is, you know, you don't have that. And I think some people are doing it well. I mean, I think King's Cross is a beautifully place, and, you know, it's highly curated, and you could argue that very restrictive on its tenants. They're very clear about what you can't do and what you can do, you know, within the tenancy agreements. We don't see those, obviously, but you can feel it. But it creates a beautiful place. Sometimes, though, you go the other way, and, you know, if you can't skateboard across a thing, because if you fall over, you might sue them, and so therefore it becomes a litigious issue. And so, you know, and sometimes they'll say, well, there's a person who's sleeping rough and they can't sleep on a bench, and I've seen them actually manhandle somebody off of the estate, yeah, which is actually Spitalfields, so it's a kind of market, you know, place, office building. So I think, yes, it's a debate. I think if done well, I'm not against it, just within the kind of context of the UK.
But you also said earlier, kind of in a way, that the public realm or civic space kind of doesn't stop at, let's say, at the building, let's say the front door, you know, or at the facade. And I think this is the crucial aspect. I think King's Cross is also a highly private space, but kind of allows, and they invested a lot. And I just heard from Townsend this afternoon, kind of when we had a talk with Grizzly, but they invested firsthand because they realized that they need to in, let's say, the public spaces, so that kind of the whole development get accepted by the neighborhood of Camden, because they had a lot, they really had to turn this kind of whole picture around and invested then in that space. And without that, it wouldn't be not that successful. And they also learned from that. And that's really, I think this is in a way, and that triggers me also kind of in all the drawings. And I think we also had this last week, kind of that, because you also talk very often, and we as well, kind of often inner urbanism. So let's say these huge buildings and these campus buildings, but also let's say an open perimeter block, should be accessible to a certain extent, but there's also social control. So there is this inside out, but kind of you allow for accessibility during the day, and hopefully, and I think that is something kind of where a lot of developments here could learn from how does this buildings, let's say, work as a cluster in itself, or a courtyard in itself, kind of that is taken care of. I think we talked last time also, we were talking a lot about we need the caretakers, but why are not, let's say, the people inhabiting, working, living in that space? And if you have the mixture of working and living, we have, so to say, 18 to 20 hours a day, let's say, social control. But if we don't have this kind of programmatic mix, we will again have to create fences or other protections. And I think that is a bit the question where we need to look at to this mix of views that kind of can coexist. And the mixes are different, but kind of they kind of it's a bit like an ecosystem that supports itself at a certain point.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I don't have anything against fences, let's say, in the sense that, but it has to be structured. I think what, you know, things close down at certain times. We just want to, you know, and it might change the way in which it works or performs through the life of the day. I'm not necessarily saying, I don't think we can achieve something that is open all the time.
No, I think there's also this intimacy to a certain extent.
And so there's a kind of, we call it interior urbanity. Yeah. It's same thing. But I think it's that kind of, it's trying to understand how you can then bring a richness to the city that allows, you know, with an expanded ground floor, we were talking about it, you know, that and if the pressure of the streets, if we can absorb more civicness inside. Now, when I say inside, it could be inside the building, climatically, it could be inside the block. And, you know, the fact that it shuts down or opens up in different ways, I think it makes it richer. You know, there's one way to perceive the city, and then there's another way, and there's two different ways, you know, and you can walk your dog 6 different ways. It's not, you know, whatever, you go for a run and you can cut through here, and that's all part of what we like about our mature cities, that kind of choice and diversity, rather than actually it being, you know, sort of funneled and channeled into this kind of tunnel of, and I think that's some of the problems as well, is they're sheer, you know, these buildings, they come down to the ground, there's nothing else, they just come straight down, boom, you know.
There's not that.
Because anything else commercially is death.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you set your shop back 5 meters, for some reason, they'll go bust. You know, we don't do arcades anymore. We don't do colonnades, you know, because for some reason, retail people will tell you that can't, that commercially it's, I've never seen any empirical kind of evidence.
No.
But at the same time, you know, there's a kind of oversimplified understanding of planning and what urbanism is. And the problem is the cities they don't have the skills within their bodies to actually then facilitate that discussion.
What I found pretty interesting, but maybe also to discuss with you, the example you showed of the house of Charles and Ray Eames, and how porous and how flexible and how, let's say, open and floating, let's say, to the kind of how our economy, let's say, our lifestyle is now, kind of between work, life, leisure, and so on, kind of floating in each other. And they already dealt with that at that time within the building. And I think we lost, let's say, in planning to a certain extent, we lost this kind of being capable to let things, especially on that human scale, kind of that informs the city, the Stadtparterre, to allow for that flexibility.
I guess we had that before industrialization. No?
Yes.
It was all, families were bigger, and then workshops were bigger. Everything was intersecting. No? So because, and you showed it at the beginning. So this historic shift, or so actually you're trying to, or we're all trying maybe to get back to some kind of ideal.
Well, I mean,
Middle Ages.
There are trends and technology that's allowing us to think about that relationship. And I think, you know, what I'm finding interesting is that people, you know, the next generation, because obviously I'm a bit older now, is that, you know, they don't want to commute to work. They want to live close to where they work. And so what we call them second careerers. They actually leave their job and then they go and they want to find another kind of job which is closer to where they live, which is actually usually on the outer skirts of London. So there's a whole series of shifts that are happening, which is changing the way we think about this kind of polarized, kind of diametrically oppositional kind of relationship between live out there, come in and work here. And also because of the pandemic, people want now to have bigger spaces, more outdoor space, a little bit cheaper. So they're moving out, but now they're trying to find work and they don't want to come in. So, you know, of course you can work from home, but they need the space to work from home. So what's interesting is that we're thinking about a lot of these things. All our buildings are changing to accommodate new technology, new types of employment, maker space, innovation economy, but our housing isn't. You know, that's what I find fundamentally problematic, is that housing isn't changing.
It's not changing that much, but kind of you showed one project where you also juxtaposed with the next to the rail yards, you know, where the kind of maker spaces, with a lot of open spaces also close to the residential space, which I found pretty interesting, let's say, for London. But then I was questioning myself, this kind of what you think about this tendency about micro apartments getting smaller, but we need to have these outdoor spaces close by and really try to bring that into the third dimension. You managed to do that there, but kind of on a level of, and I think that's also in nearly all projects you've shown, kind of, especially the London ones, there's really always a kind of an urban layer, kind of that allows also for some residential spaces, kind of that even touch the ground, maybe on a podium level, but also open it up, kind of, and it's always a dialogue between these two levels. So there's not this kind of, it's always floating in each other. There's never this kind of strict border, which I think is really rich, you know, in a way, kind of to bring, if we want to have working spaces and living spaces close to each other, we need to find these differentiations between outside, inside, exposure, intimacy, kind of, but also, let's say, really layering. And you were also mentioning this word as well a lot. Kind of, it's all about layering different, let's say, networks of, let's say, distribution, the disposal, supplying kind of networks, but also pedestrian networks and so on. But allowing within that kind of overlay, let's say, this coexistence of different uses and different speeds.
Yeah, I think the challenge though is that, you know, I think Dockley is 8 stories. So that's fine. And that's probably similar and commensurate with the stuff I'm seeing around here.
Yeah.
You know, 8, 9 stories. The problem is that in London, because of land values, you know, the density is so ridiculously high that actually you're getting 20-story, 25-story residential buildings. And the problem there is that when you get these kind of co-living, collective living, kind of build-to-rent kind of environments, the developers obviously is jumping onto a kind of, you know, they're commercializing it quickly. So you end up with a 20-story tower of micro units with a little bit down on the, you know, a little bit down on the ground level and maybe on a podium. And usually it's you pay for that because it's a club with a swimming pool and a spa. And the problem is that they even say, well, we're not even going to give you a balcony because actually we can strip all the balconies out, put it all together into one big space and have it on the first floor. So, you know, these are the kind of economics that are driving UK development. So I think, you know, the challenge would be is if we have to do a 20-story, you know, how far can you layer that up? But I think, you know.
But I think you will also challenge that again, kind of like you did earlier. But I think what's interesting also, what Mike kind of mentioned is what could we learn also for, let's say here, you know, kind of development of mixed use, kind of bringing in this, let's say, layering and vibrancy into especially the production of residential neighborhoods. Because this is pretty mixed here around, and there are a lot of Baugruppen, or let's say, but there are a lot of others that are kind of what we would call island urbanism. So you just have a monofunctional, kind of very dedicated to residential, and there's not so much around. And I think some examples could be really interesting, kind of to discuss with developers here as well. And I see some people. Other questions kind of from your side here, or remarks, or? No, not at all. So I think we probably continue that informal, that is always easier. So I would say we stop the official part now. Thank you. Thank you all. Let's say the streaming part now. Thank you very much. Kind of, I think it was really rich. I also saw quite some things kind of new, but also this repeating. I think this, let's say, this togetherness, and what I find really interesting is this kind of looking always wherever, and we try to do this in Singapore as well, to the human scale. And what the people kind of that live there kind of would need, kind of the people they maneuver on street or in the courtyard or trying to get into a building and trying to find dialogue within that. And I think that is something we have to challenge our clients to get better.
I also found some.
No, kind of.
Just one other fun one. Just to add on what Schneider said, some aspects what you said, like to talk about activities and not uses. Very, very good, and that's really got one thinking. And this idea of thickness, which you mentioned a few times, the thick ground floor is really something which you can really you can picture something immediately and then go from there. So I think we can.
Yeah, but we very often do, let's say, what's very often happening, that the machine, kind of Dominic was talking about, you know, the pragmatic machine of, let's say, the office building or the residential kind of just falls on the ground, which doesn't provide vibrancy on that level, and that's a problem. Kind of what you said, it's ramming kind of like that into the ground without any interaction, and programmatic interaction or spatial kind of maneuver, this kind of membrane space, you know, between inside, outside, and this in between, where you are not already in, let's say, the building, but there is constantly a kind of a inside outside relation between public, civic, and also, let's say, the entrance space is kind of the floor plan, and that is visible. That the floor plans always, whether it's a big perimeter block or building, kind of connect to the urban context. And if this is working, this is this interior urbanism, or kind of use it.
Interior urbanity.
interior urbanity. Yeah.
Well,
Interior urbanity, and I think that is crucial, kind of that, because the city doesn't end at the kind of facade of a building, not at the entrance door. So thank you very much.
thank you.
And we will continue informally, kind of probably kind of some other questions will come around a glass of wine or beer.
Always.
Thank you.